Okay, so we've been talking about adverse childhood experiences and how prevalent they are. They're highly, highly prevalent. That means they exist a lot in the general population. So according to the 2011 to 2014, it's called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. So they're tracking things all the time for a 3-year period. And that's ongoing. So there's a 2014 to a 2017 surveillance pattern that they're looking at. The prevalence of the population having one ACE score, one of those things out of the 10, they mark 1, 2. 62% of the population, that's 2/3 of the population, have one traumatic event in their life, whether it's divorce or death of a parent or caregiver who misuses substances or has a mental illness or experiences physical abuse or emotional abuse. That's a lot. That's a lot. And we need to think about that. ACE scores of 4 or more. 4 or more. And that means 4 of those things, or 5, or 6, or 7, or 10. 16% of the population has 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. That's a lot also. And what we need to remember is that if you have one ACE score, remember, you're 80% more likely to have a second, and then 80% more likely to have a third. So they are compounding. If you have physical abuse, you may have emotional abuse as well. And then you may have emotional neglect as well. And a parent with a substance misuse disorder. I know I'm being repetitive, but I just want to really help you to understand the language and the way this particular study and information works in our society. So interestingly and not interestingly, I don't find this surprising at all. The most commonly reported adverse childhood experiences are emotional abuse. Remember, emotional rock throwing. You're worthless. You're ugly. Nobody cares about you. You're wasted space on the planet. That's emotional abuse. And household substance misuse. Now, why do I think that that's not surprising? Because I think that people who experience emotional abuse carry that with them and then replay that trauma onto the next generation. And I also think that people who experience emotional abuse at high levels actually use substances to self-medicate in order to deal with all the unresolved feelings that come with suffering from emotional abuse. You're worthless. You don't mean anything. If I feel so worthless, then I can sink into depression or I can have high levels of anxiety. And one of the ways to treat that without going to the doctor or a mental health provider is to self-medicate through drugs and alcohol. So the fact that those two things go together hand in hand doesn't surprise me at all. And I think it's so important for us to illuminate that and deal with our problems of allowing children to experience emotional abuse, because it is very common and we don't give it the recognition that it needs, because it does lead to emotional and physical health consequences in the future. All right, next slide. We need to say kind things to littles. We need to say things like, oh my gosh, the world would never be the same without you. You're the most important thing in the world. I know the world can be scary, but it's better with you in it. And I know that that can be hard when that's not the experience and you've never heard those kinds of things before, but they're the things that will transform the world. So, all right, what we do know is the higher the ACE score, the higher the risk. So the relationship to ACEs, or ACE is powerful, adverse childhood experiences, is powerful and it's graded. That means it looks like a slope. The fewer ACE score, the lower the ACE score, the lower the risk. the higher the A score, the higher the risk. So if you have a high A score, I think I've been talking about this a lot, that if you have an A score of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, this isn't uncommon using IV drugs, because people's trauma needs to be mediated or managed or handled. And a lot of times the only thing people have access to in order to self-medicate and get out of that space of being terrified really from their early trauma is significant use of drugs and alcohol. So we can guess that this person who's injecting what looks like in an alley, or just a space by himself, obviously, that he had early trauma. We don't need to judge him for injecting IV drugs. We need to look at him as a victim of early trauma and say, okay, where do we go from here, from that lens, instead of, because that's looking through a lens of resilience. Where do we go from here? How do we get out of this adversity and into a place of overcoming and thriving? And this is not an easy place to come out of and overcome and thrive. But I do know and love lots of people from this exact spot, and appreciate them and value them and think they are actual heroes because they're able to overcome this level of addiction, because it is not easy. And it is a consequence of early trauma. So this is where we're going as we move forward in understanding trauma-informed care, adverse childhood experiences, and resilience. Okay, next slide, please. That's a wrap. So resilience is the overcoming of adversity. Attachment is what happens early on in life and says, why do you belong in the world? And I'm here. There's the give and take relationship of that attachment that happens with one or two or few very attuned and loving caregivers that paves the road for consistency and predictability, so a baby or a young child understands how to approach the world and move forward in it. That's the gift of loving, attuned caregiving that leads to secure attachment in order to be able to avoid or overcome adverse childhood experiences that may or may not happen as a consequence of childhood. Things happen. People die, people get divorced, people suffer from past experiences. We will talk about this in ticker 4, epigenetics, and how trauma can be passed on epigenetically for up to 3 generations. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's fascinating to be able to dig deep and understand it. But this was ticker class number 1 of ticker module 1, or intro. And so I hope you learned a lot. I hope you're motivated to keep going. And I look forward to seeing you in class 2. Thanks for watching.